All right, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. First, I want to thank everyone for joining us. We have a nice sized group. And my name is Greg Buckingham, and I'm on the faculty here at UCF in the School of Public Administration. And our topic today in this session is identifying disparities in access to opportunities. And then hopefully by the time we get done, we'll also identify some ways to overcome that. I think we've had a very good conference. Dr. Breyer this morning, if you heard him, talked about in times of stress, in times of upheaval, we should double down on our values. And most organizations have a value of diversity or social equity, and so reaching out to those who are blocked from access to opportunities is an important topic. I just came from a session on philanthropy and how to expand philanthropy channels. And so this will very much add to that conversation. Our speaker today is Dr. Vanessa Lopez-Littleton, who is an associate professor in public administration and nonprofit management at California State University. She is also the chair of the Department of Health, Human Services, and Public Policy. And so we're very happy to have her with us. Her research interests include health inequities, social determinants of health, and racial equity. And so it's perfectly suited to our topic. So what we'll do, I'll turn it over to Dr. Littleton, and you can post any questions in the chat room. She'll speak for a bit, and then we'll have a discussion. And I invite everyone's robust participation. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Lopez-Littleton.
Thank you, Dr. Buckingham. If you have any problems hearing me, if you'll just let me know. I've had some issues with my mic before, so just let me know and I'll switch over to some AirPods. So good morning or afternoon. I'm in California, so I'm still in the morning time. I hope everyone is doing well. Today, I want to center my talk around one of the points that Dr. Breyer made this morning during the opening session when he talked about people are hurting. And I want to one-up him and say, in this case, people are dying. And so I agree with his comment about 2020 being different. The social unrest, the pandemic, the fires, increasing partisan divisions. There's so much happening in the world around us. One of the points that Dr. Breyer made was talking about structural racism. So instead of using the word structural, I'm going to use the word systemic racism as a parallel concept to mean the exact same thing. And I'm going to take some care in defining and giving you a clear example about what I mean when I say systemic racism. For me, that means I'm not going to run zigzag. I'm going to identify the problem and I'm going to run straight towards it. I realize that systemic racism is a controversial concept, but I'm going to go there anyway. And as I unpack or explain the role of systemic racism in structuring opportunities for different groups, I'm going to focus in on Black Americans as a socially constructed racial group, but also as collectively as Black people across the African diaspora. That means all people of African heritage as an ethnic grouping. And here's how I've decided to structure our time together in working with Dr. Buckingham. I'm going to talk about race and ethnic groupings and why they matter so much right now in 2020. And then I'm going to provide a contextual approach to discussing systemic racism. I'm going to provide you with a clear understanding about what systemic racism is and what it is not. Then I'm going to introduce you to the notion of being anti-racism, using an approach put forward in Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And then there will be time at the end for some dialogue and some exchange of concepts and ideas. And then the last 15 minutes of our time together will work to identify the commitments that we can make as individuals and we can make as a commitment, as a community, to move forward the value of equity as an approach to eliminating disparate or inequities in outcomes. What we're going to need at the end is one individual who's going to report out at the end of the day on these commitments. So I'll ask you to kind of keep that in the back of your head. I'll ask one of you guys to do it, not that I'm not prepared to do it, but I like to think about the concept of cultural taxation. Instead of me as a Black person having to bear the weight of the work, I would like to spread it around so that hopefully something I say will connect or resonate with someone and they'll be compelled to step out and to be more proactive in this fight for equity. And so let's get into it. As we know, racism is a construct, which means it's not real. As humans, we all belong to the human race. Socially constructed categories are used to justify racism. This includes everything from slavery to segregation and other actions that American colonizers took. Racial categories are used to group people based on physical characteristics because there's no genetic basis for race, and we know this. The problem with these racial categories is they are made to perpetuate myths and stereotypes, such that we've been taught that people with darker skin have inferior intellect or skill, and that there's somebody or some group of people to fear, or that they're even unattractive. So, but what we know is that race, the tone, the hue, the pigmentation, the amount of melanin in someone's skin has been assigned meaning and value based on cultural values that shape our society. Historically, it has been used to enslave people who were somehow deemed inferior to other people, those people who were in power at the time. So while race is not real, racism is very real, but there are many types of racism. And the people who are targets of this racism is anyone who's deemed to be non-white. So there's anti-Black racism, there's anti-Asian racism, there's anti-Latino racism. So there's different types of racism. And so once we come to understand this is about separating people and pitting groups against one another, we are better poised to develop strategies to act and move against this type of oppression. The other thing I want to talk about is I realize that systemic racism is a controversial topic. I remember over the past couple of maybe weeks or months, seeing different politicians or other officials being interviewed by the press, and they're asked, is systemic racism real? And the person will say no, right? And so that denial by people in positions of power and authority doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. What it means is that it does not matter to them, that they don't understand it, they don't get it. But from my purview, especially as a Black woman, this is a necessary and a very important conversation to have, not as, just individuals, but as communities, as, working with nonprofit organizations, working with public entities. These are conversations that we have to have in order to move our society forward. And this is particularly true for nonprofit organizations. These are the people who, like Dr. Breyer said today, are some of the most trusted organizations and people within our society. And these are the people who are entrusted with improving the lives and livelihoods of some of our most vulnerable populations. So let me back up for a second and be clear about what systemic racism is not. Because sometimes when people hear the term, I think they do all kinds of things with it in their heads. But systemic racism is not a lot of racists within an organization trying to harm Black people. That's not what that's not what systemic racism is. Systemic racism is it's not a single policy or an individual act that is somehow structured to target or harm Black folks. That's not what systemic racism is. Instead, systemic racism is an interconnected set of policies that combine to create differential outcomes. The reason we call it systemic is that these policies are embedded in many different organizations, institutions, agencies, entities. This means they're in public, private, government, and even nonprofit organizations. Because these issues are so entrenched we as individuals and our institutions have a critical role to play in dismantling these systems that create these different outcomes for different groups of people. And before I start with my example, I want to talk about why we use white people as a benchmark of comparison. And as a researcher and a scholar, I think the answer should be pretty obvious, but I'll unpack it here for you as well. So in the United States, the white population is the current majority population. But most importantly, the white population in the United States has the most access to social, economic, and political power. But just to be clear, this conversation is not about privilege or something negative towards white people. This is about the structure of the society we live in and how we operationalize a response to that system that has for decades failed a particular group of people. So let me get into my example about systemic racism and how it manifests. So in the United States, Black infants are 2 to 3 times more likely to die before the age of 1 than white infants. These babies die from birth defects, preterm, low birth weight, complications that happen with the mother before, during childbirth, from SIDS, other injuries, things like suffocation. What we know about infant deaths are that many different risk factors place Black babies at a greater risk. Here's the trick. No known combination of any of these risk factors fully account for that difference that occurs between Black and white infants. These disparities occur without regard to income, education, occupation, or even insurance status. So that a Black college-educated mother is more than twice as likely to lose her baby as a white woman with less than a high school education. What's even more difficult to understand in 2020 is that Black women are more than 3 times as likely to die from maternal complications than white women. So race itself seems to be a risk factor for these adverse health outcomes. The question on the table is, how do these Black infants and women as a group have such negative health outcomes when there's no scientific basis for grouping them together? But we've been conducting research and spending billions of dollars to close these gaps, to eliminate these gaps for more than 6 decades at least. And a lot of nonprofits have worked on these issues for decades, but relatively little progress has actually been made. Thus, we have a healthcare system without any level of accountability. What we know is that there are healthcare facilities where the majority of these deaths occur. And one of the most interesting things about these facilities is that white women don't deliver in these facilities. So even though there's a different level of treatment and access to services for these different groups. There are also different experiences with those healthcare providers within not just those facilities that have the majority of those negative results, but for decades, Black women have complained that their healthcare providers won't listen to them, or that they yell at them, or they make assumptions about them that aren't even true. Providers get to pick and choose who they deliver healthcare services to based on the type of insurance they have. They're biased providers that deliver inferior care to Black patients. The interesting thing about this is the research is the research is clear. We know this. There are different experiences for different people, not just based on their income, not just based on their insurance status, but it seems to be based on something else. And the tricky part about this is when we have these conversations, well, it's easy to just point your finger at what's so-called these bad actors and say, well, these bad actors are responsible for these negative health outcomes. But here's the deal. If we're gonna begin to improve the health outcomes for Black women and Black infants, we're gonna have to dismantle not only the healthcare system, but many of the systems that make their own contributions to the deaths of Black infants and women. So I'm gonna step on some people's toes with this, and I'll apologize later, but nonprofit organizations have a pivotal role to play in this. I used to live in the state of Florida, and I used to work at Healthy Start. And what I know is that we have organizations throughout the state of Florida who have for years received fundings to improve health outcomes, yet for decades have made relatively little progress. Yet each year they return for additional funding while producing little results. For some agencies, the sustainability of these organizations become the mission and not saving lives or reducing risk. And accountability doesn't seem to be built into any of these systems. These systems we have in the United States are seemingly too big to fail. We don't crash the healthcare system because people are dying. We don't throw out education because our children don't receive quality education. But the question on the table is not why. I mean, the question on the table is why not? Why can't we challenge these systems if they're failing people? But does it make a difference because the people who are dying or the people who are not progressing well through these systems are Black people? Would we behave differently if white women were dying in childbirth? Would we behave differently if white infants were dying before the age of 1? At what point would there be an impetus to act to save the lives of Americans? But it's not just about Black women. Women, Latinos, Hispanics, Native Americans, they're all vulnerable populations and they all have these same types of disparate outcomes. But what's most interesting about disparities is that we, as a society, don't demand better outcomes. Even when we know that where the problem is, it's the same type of lack of accountability that we see in law enforcement. We allow provider discretion to determine outcomes without any real risk or consequence to those in positions of power or authority. It's the same thing we see in officer discretion and the negative police encounters we see on the news all the time when Black men and Black women and even Black children are being murdered. The result is that no one is accountable and the body count is mounting. If there were 1, 2, maybe 3 of these categories where these disparities existed, maybe we could blame these so-called bad actors. But the fact that Black men, women, and children are at greater risk of illness, injury, disease, even COVID-19 across all income, education, occupation, and insurance status levels is evidence of a broader system at play. And so, in my opinion, officials denying the existence of systemic racism when the evidence is clear is, in my opinion, the perpetuation of a continuing cycle of violence against Black people. So it's interesting, as a scholar, I come in contact with a lot of other scholars. And one of the things that I'm often challenged on, is if you look for racialized outcomes, Dr. Lopez-Littleton, you're gonna find them. And so for my white colleagues who say this to me, they don't have to look for racialized outcomes because it doesn't affect them personally. I have to look for racialized outcomes because it does affect me, it affects my family. And thinking about using my body of knowledge to improve the outcomes, not just for me, but for my family and for my community, is important to me. So as a Black woman, I am at greater risk of dying from cardiovascular disease than any other group in America. So my work, my livelihood, the things that I do to make a living, they're all contributing to my demise. The stress of being the only one who looks like me in leadership positions, in management meetings, the stress of having to fear for the lives of my 2 Black sons, the stress that I have when I go into a healthcare encounter, that if I don't let them know that I too am a registered nurse, then who knows what would happen to me. The stress that if I speak my truth, a white person, one of my white colleagues will say to me, well, I'm poor, I'm stressed, I'm worried about my kids. I've heard all of this. And as I said, this is not about individuals. This is about a system that perpetuates disadvantage. So when you consider the collective power of people who identify as white, you realize that historically, they've been able to contribute in a real way to the founding values and principles of this country. They've been able to navigate and to lead and manage systems and institutions for decades without having to show up and prove that they're exceptional enough to be there. This is who we are. Disparities are the result of systemic racism. It shows up in housing, in education, the criminal justice system, in healthcare, in employment opportunities, who gets to lead corporations, and I could probably just go on, but I'll stop there. Yet it does not have to be this way. So how do we begin to dismantle systemic racism? How do we identify and dismantle systemic racism? One of my mentors, Dr. Kamara Jones, has been talking about this. I think the first publication that I think I read from her was published back in 2000. So for 20 years, at least. And we know even back in 1985, when Margaret Heckler at the Department of Health and Human Services wrote that Heckler report, which said, for all of the government, that these Black health disparities existed and that Black people had different experiences and different outcomes. So we've known about this since 1985 at least, where we've got really good documentation, but we've got historical data that actually goes back further. But these are reports that have come forward to say that these are like entrenched societal issues that we need to address. And so I was thinking about, kind of the charge we have and thinking about our values and going forward. So I dropped, some heavy information that, about systemic racism using something that's shocking and depressing to me, infant and maternal, mortality. And so now what I'm going to do is turn this around a little bit and say, okay, well, what's our role in this, right? Well, I'm not a healthcare provider, so how do I improve the clinical encounter for Black women? Like, what's our role as, nonprofit organizations? So I want to start by thinking about your role as an individual. And so as an individual, you can engage in self-reflection and critical conversations, the conversations you have with people that you encounter about your perspectives on race, on systemic racism, and the structure of our society and the future of our society. Here's what we know. That the journey that began in 1865 with the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation was only the beginning. The mass incarceration of Black men, women, and yes, even children, the seemingly entrenched disparities in health outcomes, the bloody catalog of oppression that includes the names of Black men and women murdered by so-called bad actors across a broad array of disciplines, represent a continuing insult that began when Africans first arrived on these shores as chattel slaves. So while we're no longer in shackles and chains, we remain entrenched in societal norms that tether us to intergenerational trauma. And taking individual responsibility to reflect on the experiences of Black people and being ready to engage in dialogue and conversation around racism and oppression, that's a powerful first step. Then using your voice and your vote to encourage others to support candidates who are seeking to advance racial and social justice. And, from where I sit, we all have a role to play in dismantling systemic racism. We do have power. We have power to create change, but we have to be willing to do our part. This country has a racist history, one in which we've never fully reckoned with. And dismantling systemic racism will require reshaping of that dominant paradigm. This means advocating for reparations for the descendants of slaves. In the same way that the Jewish people received reparations for what happened during the Holocaust, or the Native Americans received land for their removal from their ancestral land, Black people deserve reparations for the manner in which they've been treated in this country for generations. And lastly, I think that it's far past time for the US to renegotiate that social contract and include the voices and the values of all citizens. So from wherever you sit, you must demand that your policymakers, your lawmakers, advance racial and social equity by implementing accountable systems. You must demand that Black voices be heard and respected. You must reject the way that they politicize Black Lives Matter by demanding a system that is that if it's unable to stop Black people from dying at a disproportionate rate, that system needs to be redesigned and replaced with a more equitable service delivery model. It's just that simple. This means that using opportunities to center Black voices. So if you're on an all-white panel, if you could respectfully ask that some diversity be added, if you're in charge of hiring and you're recruiting employees, if you could, when you are looking at that hiring pool, if you could be a little bit more intentional about seeking efforts to diversify that hiring pool, then maybe you increase the chances of hiring more diverse personnel. And you have to figure out a way to use your platform and use your voice to drive the change that we want to see in the world. And I'll change that from we want to see, but that we need to see, because as I said, as I began, people are dying, so lives are at stake. My last comment will be on being anti-racist. I'm not going to recap the book for you, but what I want to do is to encourage you to read the book. I have a copy. It's Ibrahim Kendi's book on how to be an anti-racist. And what it forced me to do is to think about, well, what does it mean to be an anti-racist? Because it's just not the opposite of being racist, right? If you think about racist people out to cause harm or ill intent, being anti-racist, the opposite of that is, it doesn't really make sense. So being an anti-racist is more about looking for policies and practices that actually create these differential outcomes. So it's actually creating a strategy whereby to save lives. And so I do have a little piece that I want to read to you that I pulled out that I've been reflecting on for a while. But it says, racist ideas have defined our society since its beginning and can feel so natural and obvious as to be banal. But racist ideas remain difficult to comprehend, in part because they go against the flow of this country's history. To be anti-racist is to be a radical choice in the face of this history, requiring radical reorientation of our consciousness. So I've shared with you a lot of my perspective, and so now we're going to open it up for questions. So I'm interested in hearing what your questions are for me, and I'm also interested in hearing your perspective. So I have no, idea or some kind of thought that everybody's going to totally agree with me, because anytime I have these conversations with people, there are people who agree and disagree. I did a talk similar to this a couple of weeks ago in front of 1,000 people. I got one response back, and the person said, well, you're wrong. It's not systemic racism, it's genetics. And so, the person said, I've done my homework. They didn't include their homework. They didn't include the research. They didn't include their name. I could have responded back because they sent me an email, but I was like, I'm not going to do that. I presented something similar, not on systemic racism, but on health disparities at a conference in Oakland about 2 years ago. And I had a young man come up to me. He was also a researcher. And he said, well, I've done my research and I know what the problem is. The problem is a vitamin D deficiency. And so what I've said is that we've been studying this problem for decades. We've spent billions of dollars. If it was just a one issue solution, don't you think we would have solved it by now? Wouldn't we have just given Black folks some vitamin D? I mean, it's not that simple. So I'm not saying, hey, if you think it's vitamin D, tell me you think it's vitamin D. I'll respect your position. Okay, I'm gonna stop talking. Shut me up, Dr. Buckingham.
Okay, yes, so we'll take questions now. You can just use your microphone. If you feel more comfortable in the chat room typing, that's fine. Tracy, did I see you with a question or no? Or comment? Your comments are welcome also.
I was in the midst of typing that I think it's important to recognize that no effort is too small. Dr. Lopez-Littleton was giving some examples of things that we can do. Because when you're looking at systemic racism, that's big as you defined it initially. And so me as an individual, I may think, well, what can I do about a whole system? But you gave us some examples of small things that we can start with, like ensuring if there's a panel that there's some diversity, like being purposeful about hiring and recruiting. And we could probably come up with some other lists that individuals can do that are a start. And when you combine a lot of individual efforts, then you start to make some systemic change in the same way that we got here through a lot of individual, efforts on the opposite end. So I think that's an important point.
Yeah, thank you for that, Tracy. You remind me of a book, like I have a ton of books over there. Yes, and yes, we need to do that, right? We need to begin at the individual level because I think that since I've been in California, I've learned all about this reflection. It's so funny. I feel like before I came to California, I don't feel like I was reflecting at all. And now it's all I do is reflect and think deeply about these things. So I want to say yes to what you said, but then I want to say and I think that the society, we are in a moment. And if we're not careful and if we're not aggressive and proactive, and if we don't go on what I'll refer to as the offensive, then we're going to miss this opportunity. I think we have some momentum and we can't lose it. We can't retreat to say, Dr. Lopez-Littleton, I'm a professor, I've got my work to do, I'm just going to focus on what I have in front of me. I have a commitment to the next generation to make it better so that the same way I have to worry about my sons, that when my daughter has children, I'm telling her not to have any, but anyway, she don't have to worry about them in the same way. And so I'm really looking for the society to begin to shift in a real way. I'm really hopeful about that. Yeah, and I think we all have a role to play in that.
Amy, I see you with your hand
Yes.
metaphorically raised.
So I'm of Jewish descent, just to give some context. My maternal grandparents were Holocaust survivors. So this idea of reparations, I've heard before, and it's one that's kind of stuck with me. So I'm really curious as to, what your perspective is on what appropriate reparations would be. I feel like with the Native Americans whose lands were taken away, it was kind of an obvious decision to give them back lands. So, but with slavery, you can't take back the damage that was done. So I'm curious as to what you think appropriate measures would be.
Yeah, so I'm not gonna meet this one with snark. I'm gonna behave myself, because the only thing that I can think of is we live in a society that is a capitalist society. And in order to make a capitalist society move, you need money. So I'm thinking money. And people, one of the challenges, I think a couple of years ago, Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote in The Atlantic about the case for reparations. And I'll be honest with you, I've read probably more than a dozen articles about what people think. And as an individual, I'll say this, I'm not the policymakers. I'm not going to tell people what to do. I don't have an agenda. I think it needs to be done. I think it needs to happen in a real and meaningful way. I think, what's his name? James Cotton, he said that if you, I'm going to mess up the quote, but I think that the takeaway is that if we are not careful as a society, the people that we have in a society will turn on us and cause these types of disruptions. And so I am really struck by the fact that the United States doesn't think it owes anything to the descendants of slaves. And so the fact that you can put someone in bondage for hundreds of years and then let them loose, to think that at some point they'll just get there on their own without any type of equitable action to say, hey, we can provide you with some support as it relates to education, or we can provide you with a pathway so that you can at least have access to healthcare. So we even know that we have yet to overcome the slave health deficit. So there are things that we can begin to do that aren't necessarily tied to financial gains for individuals, but providing people with access to quality healthcare services could be a start. So we could start there. We could start with education. Instead of making education about your property taxes in the immediate area where you live, where we know what has happened historically. I just think that there's so many issues. I'm going to stop talking. I don't want to yap too much about it. There's historical issues about the way our education system is structured. And so having a conversation about reparation that centers on education, on healthcare, on the criminal justice system, I think that those are even more valid or valuable conversations to begin to have. I'll end my rant there, sorry.
Thank you, that was really helpful.
And Elaine, you have a comment, and then Roshana. You're muted.
Gotcha, thank you. I just wanted to say to Ms. Lopez-Littleton that my reaction is not any of those that you exampled earlier by your previous audiences in any way, shape, or form. And you have the word believe behind you, and I absolutely believe every word that you spoke. And I've pretty much for most of my life been a person who's been aware of the inequities with Black folks in America, and it breaks my heart and it makes me angry. And I'm so glad that we're having these conversations. However, I don't even know how you and others stay positive because looking at the political climate that we're in right now, it's hard for me even to stay positive that any of this will change. I know things have changed, things have progressed over hundreds of years, but I guess I want to know, how you stay positive and keep going. And just one other thing, I have done a lot. I talk when neighbors or anybody says something stupid, I, bring out another perspective to them. And I've given to Stacey Abrams' campaign and, many other campaigns and Urban League and other organizations like Black Votes Matter. But what else, and in my job, I bring up issues and say, like, can we put more information on our website and things like that? And so what else can I and other people do? I was thinking about, I would love to join an organization if that's wanted, or if you can recommend something.
Yeah, thank you okay. So I really want to say thank you for getting it. Yeah. And so I really want to acknowledge that. I want to say, if you're not a member of the NAACP, you should consider joining. I think a lot of non-Black folks are sometimes hesitant to participate in the NAACP, but I will say that there were white people who actually helped to start and found that organization. And so it still has such an incredible and important role in our society. I've been a member, but I typically don't go to the meetings, but I put it on my calendar for the rest of the year. I need to be a part of that organization because it has such a historic and ongoing role. And when things happen in our communities, the NAACP will act. And so even if we don't respond to them the way that we should, if we don't donate and support them, when there are problems in the Black community, folks from the NAACP will show up. And so I would say if there's one thing that you could add to your resume, which seems to be pretty great already, I would say consider joining an NAACP, your local chapter, and just asking, what can I do? Having these conversations with your colleagues. I know a lot of my friends get involved in these heavy discussions on social media. I don't do that. I don't do it because I don't want to. I want to engage in conversations with people like this, like people who, you know, that I can pour into them and they can pour into me. Not we're just doing these little blurbs or whatever for show or whatever they call it out there now. I don't do it. And so I want to say that if you're courageous enough, bold enough, with enough free time, get involved in that social media stuff. That's not my lane, but you can do that.
Thank you.
And Roshana?
Hi. So first and foremost, I wanted to say this is very informative. I was very excited to be in this breakout room. My question is, well, in context. So I used to work in leasing for low-income housing in the land. And what I found is that our manager, who herself was a minority, had this instilled in her head that the community had to look a certain way. So I often found myself fighting with her in regards to pushing certain applications through for people who qualified, just because she would say, oh, well, you know, they're from Puerto Rico like me, so I know how they are. Or, you know, oh, she has 7 kids. And I'm like, it's low income housing. That's what it's for. It's to enable those people to have an opportunity to get from where they are to where they want to go, kind of thing. And now as a child protective investigator, I find that a lot of the families that constantly get cases called in are minorities, due to the fact people may not understand how they discipline or why they chose to tell their child this versus that. And their main question is always housing. So that's kind of burned the fire in me for transitional housing. So my question was, how do you, in essence, as someone who's now starting out, what do you do to kind of get the information and kind of get the ball rolling to get these concepts and ideas so people can see that it is not just a figment of imagination? It is black and white, it's in front of you, like, and you should be taking the time to, in essence, jump in and help.
Yeah, so that's a good question. And as an educator, I want to say, if you partner with your colleges and universities, they are a wealth of information. And so what you'll find is that sometimes when people won't listen or receive the information from people in the community or people even in their jobs, that sometimes when they're talking with people who have different titles, that they'll be more responsive to those folks. And I'll be honest with you, that's one of the reasons I got my Ph.D. and went into academia. I was in a nonprofit sector. I started off as a case manager and worked my way up to an executive director. So I know what it's like to, you know, have to exist in an environment with people who, you know, here's the deal. You can't stereotype or make generalizations about groups of people. And so even, you know, people like to think that, you know, if you elect or you put Black people into office, that we're all going to be Democrats. We're all going to think and have this monolithic view. And we know that that's not true. And so what we have to do is focus more on educating people where they are. People are not going to just get it. You're not going to be able to just say it one time and you're going to be done. I've been on health disparities now since 2006. I laugh because I'm like, it's been a long time, like, and maybe even before then. And so I've been beating this drum for a very long time. And I'm working with one of my colleagues out of NYU on this article that we're submitting today. And it's on misogynoir. I always mispronounce it. But anyway, it's just when Black women have like these negative encounters, and it's because of our intersecting identities. Not only are we Black, but we're also women. So we've got this double whammy. And when we as a society push back or devalue women, and then we push back and we devalue Black people. So as a Black woman, I'm getting, kind of like this, the weight of the world it's like before me. And so how do I begin to educate or create an awareness in my colleagues? So I'll tell you about one small thing that I started doing on my campus. It's called Building Communities Through Dialogue. And I just started having almost kind of like a book club, a little session. We've been doing it for 2 years now, but we just have these great discussions about race and whatever else comes up. But I have developed a coalition of folks who we are very supportive of one another. We talk to other people, so we don't just keep it within ourselves. We use a book, I'll drop it in the chat, but this book is called Emergent Strategy. It's by Adrienne Marie Brown. But what this book does is it teaches us how to strategically build these alliances, how to strategically have these conversations with people. And a lot of this is about the work that we do on ourselves. And so if we don't learn how to build these types of this resiliency within ourselves, so that it's not just internal, but it's external. It's a part of my dialogue. It's a part of the way that I communicate myself to the world. Then, it can be just a process. And so what I've learned probably over the past 2 to 3 years, I've been working with this book. It's not just a book you pick up and read it from cover to cover. It's a book where you read it, you work with it, you use the examples, there's worksheets, there's, different ways that you have to dialogue and work around it. But I think that these are the types of tools that we have to use in order to grow our ability to change the world. And so it's this type of intentional effort that's needed to get us to where we're trying to go. I'll type the book in there.
Okay. There is a question in the chat room about additional things to read or provoke thoughts on reparations. And I know you've posted the Atlantic article. Anything else that comes to mind? And secondly, I have a question about, and you were just touching on this a little bit, but individuals make changes. And so how do you have any steps from how to be an anti-racist or other things you've read, little steps to get people to even open a short conversation? Because a lot of these things we're talking about have a knee-jerk reaction and it's closed automatically. Are there any tips you've got on being able to just get an open mind a little bit to think about these things?
Yeah, I'm going to tell you guys two things that I've done. I'm not a troublemaker by any stretch of the imagination. I'm actually very nice. Coming out of my public administration background, I know how to work within a public sphere. But I've asked questions like, how would I know if racism was operating here? And we were working on something to do with the curriculum, and I was in a room with about 3 white people, and they were trying to assign the one Black person to the lower division classes, and then the white people were getting the upper division classes. And the Black person didn't want the lower division. She wanted to be, because she also had a Ph.D., so she wanted the students who were about to graduate as well. And so I just asked the question, how would we know if racism was operating here? And, and I did it in I didn't think it was offensive or threatening. I was just curious, and what it did is actually open up a conversation. People just, they didn't dig in to say, well, this is not racist and, and I'm not a racist. Are you calling me a racist? Absolutely not. I'm not calling anyone a racist. I'm trying to understand, how do we structure opportunities for people of color within this organization? If it is ideal for faculty members, like it's a goal to teach students who've already matriculated, who are about to graduate, as opposed to teaching, first-time freshmen, where you've got to do more work in there with them, then why is it that the white people, and I'm just asking, it could be that they've been here longer. Maybe there's a really good explanation that I don't know because I hadn't been here long, but it created an opportunity to have that conversation. So if you're not quite that bold, what you could do is because the whole idea is to just think about the outcome. So where you begin with the end in mind, right? So if you know that the outcome of this set of actions or these policies are creating something different for different groups of people, then you owe it to those people to question the policy, to try to understand, how is racism happening here? What is the system? What is the policy? And where I've been working with a lot of organizations, they don't have policies. They just have practices. This is the way that we've always done it. Well, why? And then if you have a system or a set of policies or practices that are creating these negative outcomes for people, I think it's a great thing to begin to ask the question, what can we do differently? Who can we hold accountable? Why are these things happening? I was saying about me working at Healthy Start. When I worked at Healthy Start, we were on a downward spiral, as far as I'm concerned, for our Black infant mortality rates in Seminole County. Black babies were, I think, like 6 or 7 times more likely to die in Seminole County than white babies. I was like, this is appalling, but it was almost like our hands were tied because we can't go out there and physically help people have healthy pregnancies, even though that's our mission. And every year the state gave us more and more money to do it. So these are things that, we have to think strategically about how we approach and work within our spheres of influence to make these differences. And so I think that there are ways that we can do these things strategically, having these conversations with other people, doing that type of deep reflection, and then, getting other people to be a part of those conversations. I think all those things are critical.
We have a question in the chat room, and we have about 8 minutes left to our session, so we'll just keep that balance in mind. Marcia has asked a good question. It's a longer question, so I'm going to kind of paraphrase, but the upshot is that in a lot of leadership positions in nonprofits, we don't have people of color or women represented. And so are there some best practices to get a more diverse set of leaders, which then may allow for a greater set of policies or a wider set of policies? Any best practices, as far as bringing in a more diverse set of leaders?
Yeah, so I'll just talk about 3 things that I've been hearing a lot about. Now with the shift to the virtual world, there's no reason why you can't open up your boards to more, what I want to say, it doesn't just have to be the people like in your community. And so if it's an opportunity where you can have people from different areas participate because of the virtual work spaces that we're now in, and there's no reason why we need to just go back to requiring people to physically show up, there may be a way to leverage that to get more support for your organization. And then the other thing that I like to focus on is this creating more attractive organizations. Why would you want to, like, for instance, if you're a Black person and you've got a white board that's asking you to come on board, and I'm a majority white board, I want to say a white board, what's your impetus for doing that? Even if you care about the work that they're doing in the community, you're going to have to go on that board and be the only person of color. So anytime that there's an issue related to race or anything, they're going to be looking at you. And that's what we call cultural taxation. And we try to avoid that. We try to share the wealth so that, people aren't overburdened by this thing called race and racism and having to constantly respond to things to do with race. And so I would say if you can create a more attractive organization where people will want to come onto that board. So for instance, if within your bylaws, changing those bylaws to include some type of requirement where you do have to have different types of diversity. And maybe you do like what we're thinking about doing on our campus, like hiring, doing like a cluster hire so that you get a group of people who come on at the same time to add diversity. And you're not adding them one at a time where they're isolated and have to try to figure out how best to assimilate into the organization. And then the other thing I say, it's the power of the network. If you look at your LinkedIn page and there's only white folks on there, then you probably need to expand your network. And so if you go through and look at all your board members and you look at their primary contacts, if there's no diversity there, then ask yourself, why are you even trying to diversify your board? It seems like, you need to figure out a way to make the organization more attractive to people of color, where we would feel like, even if I did go on this particular board, I'd have a voice and they value my voice and I'd be a part of the organization. And I wouldn't be the lone Black person looking to speak and represent all Black people, which I could never do.
Yeah, Elaine has a comment, and we have about 5 minutes, and then they will shift us, I think, to the final segment. So just keeping that in mind.
I will make this so short, but to follow up on what Dr. Lopez-Littleton just said, and the question was great. And it just so happened this morning, my chair of our board was on a conference call with our CEO and some other people from around the community. And he said he had invited this really sharp young Black man to join the board. And the question of that young man was, how are you progressing on diversifying your board? That was like his first question. And the board chair said, he sort of opened my eyes to, a problem. I mean, we do have a few Black folks on our board, but not many. But so that was I just wanted to tell that story. And that is a kind of like a positive a story. And, but your suggestion about bringing in possibly 2 or more Black folks to the board at once, I think I'm going to share that with my board. So thank you.
Yeah. So Greg, I know one of the things we have to have is somebody to report out. Are you going to do that?
Well, is there a volunteer from the participants who would like to report out 1 or 2 things from our session?
And I think that they're more interested in things that we can commit to doing. So not like recapping like everything I said, but just like.
Well, we haven't really talked about commitments, have we? We've got some ideas. What if folks could type some things that you might commit to in the chat room? Darlene, I saw your video come on. Did you want to make a comment or?
I just want to say right now with my organization, and great presentation, by the way, Dr. Lopez-Littleton. Our organization, we're going through a racial equity training right now with all of the leadership, because it starts with us at the top. And we have to do 12 hours of this. I think we just did our third one. And it's about dismantling white privilege. That's what we're working on. And one thing that we've been talking about is being intentional in our acts and what we're saying. Is not about just saying, oh, I have a Black friend. Oh yeah, I work with a lot of Black people, we get along. That don't mean crap to a person of color. That just means you have a Black friend. Okay, what are you doing when you're, somewhere and you hear people making Black jokes about, stereotyping Black people? Are you being quiet but saying I have a Black friend? That doesn't mean anything to us. It's about intentionally reacting when you're seeing and hearing stuff that's not right. It's about going back to your core values of, I want somebody to respect me, so I should, you want somebody to respect everybody. So And I know in our area in Orlando, there's signs that say, if you see something, say something. They're doing that related to crime. It's not just about crime. It's about if you see something that's wrong, say something. Don't just sit and wait for it to hit the news or whatever and say, oh yeah, I saw that, and then want to, you know, talk to people about it. No, if you see it, say it. Don't let it evolve. Be in the moment and present at that time, and intentional in your reaction to warn stuff to be, you know, to be right, for people to do right. So that's what I've been taught, because I'm a parent of 4 Black boys. And to me, this has been hitting home since I birthed a kid. I've been having conversation with my kids that people that are not of color have to ever say to their kids. You never have to tell your kids to, it's always been respect the police, do this. But my friends that are not Black never had to tell their kids that, because they don't have to worry about them not coming home, you know, because they went to the store to get some chips or something. They had a hood on their head. You know, that type of stuff. It's just stuff that happens in households of non-white people that we have to live and breathe every day. And a lot of people, and it comes from an area of ignorance, because people just don't know. You don't know what you don't know if you're not experiencing it. So, but what I challenge my counterparts with is, we've been talking about stop killing us forever and stop mistreating us forever. It's up now. We need the people that look like the people that are killing us to say stop. And that's what we're starting to see now, that people that don't look like us are telling people that look like them, stop, it's not right. So that's why the media is fighting with a lot of stuff, because now everybody of every race, color, creed, religion is getting involved in this, which is exciting for me.
Quick, Vanessa, do you want to make a quick comment?
Yeah, the
Thank
only
you,
thing I was
Darlene.
gonna say is, yes, I totally agree with you, Darlene. And I think that goes to Elaine's earlier point about how do we stay motivated? Like, how do we keep doing it? We don't have a choice. Like, our lives are at stake. Like, we have to do this work. And so our only ask is that other folks join in and be a part of that.
Okay, we are going to have to end this session because the final session will begin. I can report out, I wrote down the things that people put in the chat room, but I invite you, Vanessa, to add anything to that. And I invite all of you to join the session. I do want to thank Dr. Lopez-Littleton for leading us through a very thoughtful discussion. And the reading material you posted, I also appreciate that very much. All right. So I'll end this and everybody switch over to the final session of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you, guys.